The highway stretched ahead, bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun. Cars zipped past in a steady rhythm, but Officer Carter's focus locked onto one, a black sedan drifting slightly between lanes, nothing too erratic, nothing that screamed immediate danger, but enough to trigger his instincts. Something wasn't right. He had spent years on the force and had learned that sometimes trouble didn't announce itself loudly, sometimes it crept in through the smallest details: a car moving just a little too slow, a driver gripping the wheels just a little too tight, a gaze in the rearview mirror that held just a little too much fear. Carter sighed, adjusting his grip on the wheel. As he flicked on his patrol lights, the red and blue flashes illuminated the pavement ahead, bouncing off the reflective highway signs. The sedan slowed for a moment, as if the driver was deciding something, then gradually pulled over to the side of the road. Carter watched the brake lights glow red, like a pulse, steady but tense. He grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Carter. I'm conducting a routine traffic stop. Black sedan, plate number 864 Lima Charlie, requesting plate check, over." The radio crackled in response, but he didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he pushed open his door, stepping onto the road, his boots meeting the pavement with a firm, deliberate thud. The warm air carried the distant hum of the city, mixed with the occasional roar of passing trucks. He adjusted his belt, rested a hand near his holster, but didn't reach for it yet. Always better to approach with caution but not aggression. As he neared the driver's side window, the sedan's tinted glass reflected his own image, a tall figure, uniform, crisp badge gleaming. He could see the silhouette of the driver inside, unmoving, waiting. Carter knocked lightly on the window. "Roll it down, sir." For a second there was no response, just the idling hum of the engine. Then, with a slow, almost reluctant motion, the window slid down, revealing the driver, a middle-aged man, unshaven, lines creasing his forehead, eyes dark and watchful. His fingers gripped the steering wheel tight, the knuckles slightly pale. Carter took in every detail: the slight tremble in the man's jaw, the way his shoulders were just a little too stiff. Even before the man spoke, Carter could feel it. Something was wrong. "License and registration, please, sir." The driver hesitated just for a second too long, before reaching over to the passenger seat, his fingers digging into the worn leather of a glove compartment. He pulled out the requested documents, but his hand was tense, like he was holding onto something more than just paper. Carter took the license with a smooth, practiced motion, glancing at the name David Hensley. He flicked his gaze back to the man, whose eyes were locked onto him with something unreadable, not fear, not defiance, something else. "Where are you headed tonight, Miss Hensley?" Carter asked, his tone steady, casual, but his body was already on alert. Years of experience had trained him to notice the smallest cues, and everything about this man screamed unease. "Just passing through, officer," the man replied, voice low, scratchy, like he hadn't spoken in hours. Carter nodded, seemingly satisfied, but his eyes moved lower, almost instinctively, scanning the driver's arms, and that's when he saw it, a tattoo curling around the man's forearm, partially hidden beneath the rolled-up sleeve. Black ink, bold, intricate, but more than that, familiar, so familiar that for a split second Carter's breath caught in his throat. The symbol, jagged, sharp-edged, intertwined with an eerie spiral. He had seen it before, but not just anywhere. In a file buried deep in a case that had haunted him for years, a case that had never been solved, a case that had left a family shattered and a boy missing without a trace. His pulse pounded in his ears, his grip on the license tightening. He forced himself to keep his face neutral, but something in his eyes must have changed, because the man noticed his posture stiffened just slightly, his fingers twitching over the steering wheel. Carter inhaled slowly, the air suddenly thick. His voice remained even, but the weight behind it had shifted. "Sir, where did you get that tattoo?" The man blinked too fast, his mouth opened then closed, like he was picking his words carefully. "It's just a design," he finally said, but his voice wavered just a fraction. Carter didn't move, didn't look away. His mind was already running, already connecting dots, already reaching for his radio again. But something told him not to, not yet, because something was about to happen, something was about to break, and Carter needed to be ready. The driver's fingers drummed against the steering wheel, a steady, nervous rhythm. His eyes flickered toward the side mirror, then back to Carter. His breathing was measured, But Carter could see the tension in his shoulders, a tightness that didn't belong to someone just getting pulled over for a routine stop. Something was off, something deeper than just a traffic violation, and Carter knew that feeling well. He had felt it before, standing in dimly lit crime scenes, flipping through old case files, hearing the desperation in a mother's voice as she begged for answers that never came. Carter kept his posture relaxed, but his senses were on full alert, his eyes fixed on the tattoo curling along the driver's forearm. The ink was faded, but the design was unmistakable, an emblem tangled in sharp edges and spirals, a mark he had seen before, not in traffic stops, not in everyday encounters, but in one particular case, a case that had haunted him since the day he first read the report, a case that had never been closed. "Where did you get that tattoo, Sir?" Carter asked again, his tone steady, measured, giving nothing away. The driver swallowed, a muscle in his jaw twitching like he was calculating his next move, deciding whether to lie or run. His fingers tensed against the wheel, his foot shifted slightly over the pedals, a move so small most officers wouldn't have noticed, but Carter did. He saw it. He felt it, a warning before the storm. "I told you it's just a design," the man said, his voice gruff like sandpaper. But Carter could hear what lay beneath it: hesitation, discomfort, fear. Carter didn't move, didn't blink. "Funny, because I've seen that design before on crime scene photos from a kidnapping case that's still unsolved." The second those words left Carter's mouth, the air in the car changed. It thickened, tightened, turned electric. The man's face barely shifted, but Carter saw it: the slight widening of the eyes, the clenching of his jaw, the silent confirmation that he knew exactly what Carter was talking about. The silence stretched long and heavy. Carter's fingers hovered near his radio, his thumb itching to press down and call for backup, but something told him to wait just a second longer to see what the driver would do, because people made mistakes under pressure, and Carter was counting on that. The man licked his lips, shifting in his seat, his right hand twitching just a little too close to the glove compartment. Carter's muscles coiled, ready for anything. "Sir, I need you to keep both hands where I can see them." Now his voice was calm but firm, no room for argument. The driver's eyes flickered to the side mirror, again checking the road, checking for a way out, calculating. Carter could see it, the gears turning, the fight or flight instinct kicking in. "I didn't do anything wrong," the driver said, his voice lower this time, more controlled. But Carter wasn't fooled. He had heard that tone before, from people who had everything to hide, from people who were about to make a bad decision. "I didn't say you did," Carter replied, still unreadable. But now his stance shifted just slightly, a silent warning. He wasn't playing games. Whatever was about to happen, it would be decided in the next few seconds. The driver exhaled, slow, forced, deliberate. Then suddenly his right hand moved too fast toward the glove compartment. Carter's instincts fired. He took a step back, his own hand snapping toward his holster. "Sir, stop right now, hands where I can see them." The driver froze, one hand still hovering over the latch of the glove compartment, his breathing, sharp eyes locked onto Carter, a silent war playing out in the space between them. Carter's heart pounded, but his focus was razor sharp. He wasn't letting this man go, not now, not when the truth was sitting right there beneath the surface. Backup would be arriving soon, but Carter didn't know if he had seconds or minutes before this turned into something worse, before the driver decided that whatever was in that glove compartment was worth the risk. Carter's voice came again, steel-edged and final. "I won't say it again, hands on the dashboard now." And then the driver made his choice. The moment stretched long and thin like a wire pulled tight, ready to snap. The driver's fingers hovered over the glove compartment, his chest rising and falling too fast, his eyes flicking between Carter's face and the road like he was calculating whether he could make a move before Carter did. But Carter wasn't new to this. He had seen men like this before, men with too much to hide and too much to lose, men who thought hesitation meant weakness. But Carter knew better. Hesitation meant something was coming, something dangerous, something desperate. "Sir, I won't ask again." Put both hands on the dashboard. Now Carter's voice was sharp, cutting through the thick air like a blade. The driver's jaw clenched, his nostrils flared, his hand twitched. But he didn't move, his breathing turned shallow, rapid, his body coiled like a spring. Carter's fingers tightened near his holster, his instincts screaming at him that this was about to go sideways. He could almost hear the crack of tires on pavement, see the flicker of motion before it happened. Then the driver bolted. Not out of the car, not yet, but his hand yanked the glove compartment open so fast that Carter barely caught the blur of movement, a flash of metal, something small, something deadly. Carter's body reacted before his mind did. His hand snapped to his weapon, drawing in one smooth, practiced motion. "Drop it now," Carter's voice boomed across the road, his feet shifting into a steady stance, his heart hammering, but his aim locked and unshaking. The driver's fingers wrapped around something, a pistol, snub-nosed, small, but just as deadly at close range. His other hand fumbled with the gear shift, like he was about to make a run for it, but Carter had already stepped closer, cutting off that option. "I said drop it." Carter's voice was fire now, no room for doubt, no room for negotiation. One wrong move, and this entire situation would go up in flames. The driver froze, his chest heaving, his hand gripping the gun, but not raising it yet, not pointing it, just holding onto it like it was his last chance at control. His face twisted with something Carter had seen before, not just fear, not just guilt, something deeper, something closer to panic, like he wasn't just afraid of getting caught, he was afraid of what getting caught would mean. 3 seconds stretched into eternity. Carter could hear his own breath, steady, controlled, his trigger finger ready, but not yet, pulling his mind, calculating every possibility, every movement, every way this could end. "Sir, I don't want to shoot you, but I will if you don't drop the weapon right now. This is your last warning." The driver's breath hitched, his grip tightening, his knuckles pale against the metal. Carter saw the moment it happened, saw the exact instant the man made his decision. His weight shifted, the gun moving just slightly, and Carter had to make his own choice, faster than thought, faster than instinct. Before the driver could even bring the gun up, Carter lunged forward, his left hand shooting out, slamming into the man's wrist, knocking the weapon loose, metal clattering against the dashboard. In the same motion, Carter yanked the door open, grabbing the driver's arm, twisting it behind his back, as the man let out a sharp curse, struggling for half a second before Carter shoved him against the side of the car, pinning him hard. "Don't move," Carter growled, voice low, breath coming fast, his knee pressing against the man's leg, keeping him locked in place. With one hand, Carter reached for his radio, his pulse still pounding in his ears as he pressed the button. "Dispatch suspect in custody, attempted to draw a weapon, send backup now." The driver gritted his teeth, his forehead pressing against the car, his breath ragged. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice strained. "You don't know what you just did." Carter tightened his grip, something cold settling in his stomach. The way the man said it, the way his voice wavered, it wasn't just anger, it wasn't just fear, it was something else, something worse. Carter leaned in slightly, his voice sharp, measured. "Then why don't you explain it to me?" The driver exhaled slow, like he was finally giving in, like he knew he had no way out anymore. Then he said something that made Carter's blood turn to ice. "You think this is about me, but you're wrong. You just made a mistake, bigger than you can imagine." Carter's grip on the driver's wrist tightened, his mind bracing, his pulse hammering against his ribs, the weight of the words settling in like a thick fog. He had heard plenty of desperate men say plenty of desperate things, but this was different. The way the driver said it, low, quiet, almost resigned, sent a cold chill crawling down Carter's spine. This wasn't a man just trying to scare his way out of an arrest. This was something else, something worse. "What do you mean?" Carter's voice was steady, but his muscles were coiled, ready for anything. The driver let out a slow, rugged breath against the side of the car, his forehead pressed to the cool metal. "You shouldn't have stopped me tonight. You don't get it. I was trying to get out. I was trying to leave all of it behind. But now it's too late. You don't even know what you just walked into." Carter's jaw tightened, his instincts screaming that this wasn't just some cryptic bluff, something deeper was at play, something bigger than a simple traffic stop. "Who's after you?" Carter pressed, but the driver just shook his head, his fingers twitching against the cruiser's hood. "You don't want to know." Carter's radio crackled to life, dispatch responding, backup en route. The sound barely registered because in the next second something shifted. A strange stillness fell over the road. Carter had spent years on the force, enough time to recognize when things went wrong, but even then he wasn't ready for what happened next. A black SUV rounded the corner, moving fast, headlights cutting through the darkness. Carter didn't like the way it approached, too precise, too deliberate. His instincts played the same way they did in dark alleys, before gunfire erupted, before suspects made their final desperate moves. "Keep your head down," Carter snapped, pushing the driver lower against the car. But the man didn't resist, didn't even look surprised, just let out another breath, like he had already accepted whatever was coming. Carter's hand moved to his holster, his stance shifting as the SUV came to a slow crawl, then stopped 20 feet away. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out dressed in black. A presence so calm sent an immediate warning through Carter's veins. He wasn't just some bystander, wasn't a curious driver passing through, he was here for a reason. "Officer Carter," the man's voice was smooth, almost polite, like he was used to talking his way in and out of trouble, like he had done this before many times. Carter didn't move, didn't answer, didn't lower his stance. He didn't know who this guy was, but he knew exactly what he was dealing with, the kind of person who didn't need to shout to make himself dangerous, the kind of person who walked into situations already knowing how they would end. "Step back into your vehicle, sir. This is a police matter," Carter said evenly. The man just smiled, shaking his head slightly. "I'm afraid it's not that simple. That man you have there belongs to us, and we need him back." Carter's grip on the driver's wrist didn't loosen, not an inch, not even as the man in black took a slow, measured step forward. "That's not how this works," Carter said, voice edged with steel. "He's in custody. If you have something to say about it, you can do it downtown." A pause, a flicker of amusement in the man's dark eyes before he tilted his head slightly. "You don't know what you're stepping into, officer, and trust me, you don't want to." Carter's stomach coiled tight, his gaze flicking toward the SUV. For half a second, another figure visible through the tinted glass, sitting motionless, waiting like a shadow in the back seat. The driver beneath Carter let out a slow exhale, voice barely above a whisper. "You should let me go now, before it's too late." Carter didn't move, but his heart pounded because for the first time that night he realized he wasn't just dealing with a routine stop or a desperate criminal. He had stumbled into something much worse, something that had been waiting in the dark for far too long. Carter's grip on the driver stayed firm, but his mind was already racing. The SUV idled 20 feet away, its engine, a quiet steady hum like a beast waiting to strike. The man in black stood between them, hands loose at his sides. But there was something in the way he held himself, something too calm, too certain, like he already knew how this would end. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be, officer," the man said, his voice smooth, measured, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to be dangerous. "Just let him go and walk away." Carter's jaw tightened, his fingers flexing near his holster. He had been in plenty of bad situations before, but this one felt different. This wasn't just some gang member trying to intimidate him. This was deeper, more controlled, more rehearsed, like it wasn't the first time this man had done something like this. "That's not happening," Carter said, his voice even, but inside his gut twisted. This was bad, and he knew it. Backup was on the way, but every second felt like a countdown to something worse. The driver against the car let out a slow breath, his head turning slightly, his voice low. "You don't get it, officer. If you take me in, they won't let it slide. You're putting yourself in something you can't walk away from." Carter ignored him, his eyes locked on the man in black. "I don't know who you think you are, but this is a police matter. If you try anything here, you'll be making the worst mistake of your life." The man's lips curved slightly in something that wasn't quite a smile, more like an acknowledgement, a quiet understanding that they were at a crossroads. One way led to Carter letting the man go, the other led to something much worse. "I admire your sense of duty, officer. Really, I do," the man said, taking another slow step forward. "But trust me when I say the badge won't help you here. Let him go, and you won't have to find out why." Carter didn't move, didn't speak. The air between them was thick with something unspoken, a game being played with no clear rules. Then something shifted. The back door of the SUV opened smoothly, silently, and another figure stepped out, tall, broad, moving with a grace that didn't match his size. He was older, late 50s, maybe with silver hair slicked back, his suit crisp, expensive, but his eyes were what made Carter's pulse spike, dark, cold, calculating. The driver beneath Carter tensed, his breath coming faster. No, 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 you don't want this, officer, trust me. Carter's hand hovered over his radio, but the silver-haired man spoke first, his voice deep, steady. You have no idea what you're interfering with, Officer Carter. The way he said his name sent an instant alarm through Carter's brain. They knew who he was. This wasn't random, this wasn't just some traffic stop gone wrong. They had been prepared for this. Carter's mind sharpened, his training ticking in every detail, mattered the way the silver-haired man stood, the way the man in black stayed just slightly behind him, the way the driver in his custody looked like he was about to collapse from fear. This wasn't just about the driver, this was about something bigger, and Carter had just stepped right into the center of it. Who are you? Carter asked, his voice firm, steady, but his heart pounded harder than before. The silver-haired man smiled, but there was no warmth in it, just calculation. You already know that doesn't matter. What matters is what happens next. You can hand him over and drive away, or you can force us to handle this differently, but I promise you, officer, you won't like that outcome. Carter's radio crackled, dispatch backup, 2 minutes out. 2 minutes, 2 minutes, that suddenly felt like a lifetime too long. The silver-haired man tilted his head slightly, like he had heard the call too, like he was deciding whether 2 minutes was too long to wait. Carter inhaled, slow, steady, kept his hand firm on the driver, and made his choice. The seconds dragged on like they were fighting against time. Carter's hand stayed tight on the driver, his grip a silent warning that he wasn't about to back down, but every instinct in him screamed that he was running out of time. The man in black was still standing there, calm, controlled, his eyes never leaving Carter, while the silver-haired man behind him took a step closer, like he was testing the space between them, like he was waiting for Carter to make his move. Carter's heart pounded in his chest, but he held steady. The driver beneath him was still tense, every breath short and ragged, but Carter couldn't let go, not yet. He had to buy time, had to hold the line until backup showed up. You don't understand, officer, the driver whispered again, his voice almost pleading. They'll come for you if you don't let me go. Carter's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. His mind was racing. He had heard desperation in people's voices before, but this felt different. This wasn't fear of getting arrested. This was something else, something worse, something that wasn't just about getting out of a ticket, but about surviving, something bigger than just the law. The silver-haired man took another step forward, and Carter could feel the tension rise, the air thick with the unspoken words, the threat that lay just beneath the surface. Carter's hand was still hovering over his radio, but he didn't press the button, not yet, not until he was certain of what was happening. The man in black spoke again, his tone smooth, almost bored. You're out of your depth, officer. This doesn't end well for you unless you make the right choice. Carter didn't flinch, didn't show a crack in his resolve, but inside his gut churned. He was starting to realize that he wasn't just dealing with some low-level criminals or desperate men. These people were connected to something much larger, something far more dangerous than he had first thought. Then it happened in the blink of an eye. The silver-haired man made a swift motion, his hand reaching into his jacket. Carter barely had time to react before the man pulled out a thin black card and held it out between them. The card gleamed under the streetlights, its surface smooth and polished, a symbol etched into the center, a symbol Carter recognized the instant he saw it. No way. Carter's mind raced. The symbol on the card was unmistakable. He had seen it before in files buried deep in the archives, a symbol tied to an underground organization, so secretive and powerful that even the highest authorities had only whispers about it. No one knew how deep it ran, but the rumors were enough to make anyone with half a brain take notice. This is your last chance, officer, the silver-haired man said, his voice colder now. You don't want to get involved in this. Carter's pulse quickened as he processed what was happening. This wasn't just a routine traffic stop anymore. This was something far bigger than he had ever imagined. The man in black took a step closer, and Carter's instincts screamed at him to act, but he held back, his hand still tight on the driver, his mind running through every option. but no plan seemed perfect, no move felt safe. The radio crackled again. Backup was still 2 minutes out, but it might as well have been 2 hours. It wasn't enough time. You have no idea what you're dealing with, Carter said, his voice firm, but he could feel the weight of doubt creeping in. These men weren't just ordinary criminals, they were connected to something far more dangerous than he had ever faced. The silver haired man's smile was slow, calculated. It doesn't matter what you think you know, officer. We gave you a choice, now you're out of time. Carter's hand twitched near his holster, his gaze flickering between the men, between the driver and the looming threat that was closing in from all sides, but there was nothing he could do, not without backup, not without more information. Then something changed. The air shifted again. Carter's attention snapped back to the driver, who had been eerily silent all this time, his body stiffening against Carter's hold, his eyes flickering with a new kind of fear, something Carter hadn't seen before. "What are you saying?" Carter demanded, his voice hard. The man's gaze locked onto him, desperate. "Please, you don't know what they'll do if you don't let me go." Carter looked down at the man, his heart pounding as the world seemed to close in around him. But before he could respond, before he could make another move, the sound of an engine roared in the distance, and for the first time that night he felt a flicker of hope. Backup was close, but so were the shadows that were closing in around them. The roar of the engine grew louder and closer, but the feeling of unease didn't leave Carter, not for a second. His grip tightened on the driver's wrist, and he couldn't shake the sense that the moment of decision was fast approaching. The silver-haired man took another step closer, his smile never wavering, just an inch away from the breaking point. The man in black remained still, calculating, his eyes sharp, focused on Carter's every movement. The driver beneath Carter tensed once more, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand, officer. You need to let me go now, please. It's not just about me, it's bigger than you, it's bigger than all of us." Carter's heart rate spiked. The words sent a shockwave through him. He had heard fear before, but this was something deeper. This was the kind of fear that wasn't just for a crime. This was the kind of fear that made men talk in riddles, made them beg for mercy when they had no one to turn to. "What are you talking about?" Carter asked, his voice tight and controlled. The driver swallowed hard, eyes darting around the street, like he was expecting something else, something worse. His next words came out in a hurried rush. "You have no idea who they are, do you? They're not just criminals, they control things, they control the people who make the decisions, the people you trust, and they will do anything to get me back. They'll come for you, they'll come for your family, your badge won't protect you, they'll burn everything down." Carter's blood ran cold. The words hung in the air, heavy like a storm cloud waiting to break. But he didn't let the fear show. He couldn't show weakness, not now, not with everything on the line. "Who are they?" Carter demanded, his voice low but deadly, his eyes fixed on the driver, the silver-haired man, and the man in black. Neither of them moved, but Carter knew they were listening. Everything he did now had to count. There was no turning back. The driver closed his eyes briefly, like he was bracing for something, and then he spoke in a low rasp. "It's the syndicate, you have to believe me. They've got their hands in everything: politics, money, law enforcement. Everything you think you know about the world is a lie." The words hit Carter like a punch to the gut. The syndicate, a name whispered in dark corners by people who were either too scared to talk or too dead to speak it. But Carter had heard the rumors, he had seen the scattered fragments of evidence that pointed to something vast and powerful, an organization that moved behind the scenes, pulling strings without anyone noticing until it was too late. The backup units were almost there, but Carter could feel time slipping away. He couldn't trust these people, not when he knew they were connected to something so dangerous. "You're lying," Carter said, his voice steady, but his stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. The pieces didn't add up. The driver's fear, the calm certainty in the silver-haired man's eyes, the menacing stillness in the air, it all felt like a trap. But there was one thing Carter couldn't ignore: the look in the driver's eyes, the way his body trembled, not from cold, but from something far worse. The silver-haired man spoke again, his voice smooth and unbothered. "Officer Carter, you've made your choice, and now you will live with the consequences." Carter's instincts screamed at him to take action, but the weight of the situation held him back. The moment of hesitation cost him everything. Then the sound of tires screeching filled the air. Backup finally arrived, but it wasn't enough. The SUV's engine roared again as the vehicle began to move at a crawl, pulling closer to the sidewalk. But Carter didn't see the movement, he didn't see what was coming next. Carter's hand slid to his holster, his mind racing, every scenario playing out. But before he could make a move, the driver jerked suddenly, his body twisting, as if he was going to break free. But Carter held on tight, keeping the man in place. Then the silver-haired man stepped forward with a sharp motion, his hand reaching for the driver's arm, and with a simple gesture, he was free. The driver slumping back against the car with a resigned exhale. Carter's eyes shot to the man's face, but he didn't have time to react before the silver-haired man was gone, slipping back into the SUV with the driver in tow, and just like that they were gone, vanished into the darkness. Carter's heart pounded in his chest as he stood alone on the street, his backup finally arriving, but too late, too little, too late. The moment had passed, the danger had slipped away. What the hell just happened? Carter muttered under his breath, his eyes scanning the empty road, the only sign of the chaos that had just unfolded, the faint skid marks left behind by the SUV as it disappeared into the night. Carter stood frozen in the middle of the empty street, his mind a blur as the sound of his backup's sirens grew louder in the distance, the sharp blast of the police car's horn breaking through the stillness like a wake-up call. But Carter couldn't move, not yet. Not while the weight of what had just happened pressed down on him, heavier than any crime scene he'd ever faced. The SUV was already gone, the figures inside had vanished into the night like ghosts, leaving nothing behind but the lingering scent of danger and the echo of the driver's frantic words in Carter's head. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, officer." Backup pulled up beside him, a squad car skidding to a stop with two officers jumping out, their faces confused, but their attention focused on Carter and the scene around them. "What happened, Carter?" the younger officer asked, his voice shaky like he couldn't understand the look on Carter's face. Carter blinked once, his gaze still fixed on the empty stretch of road where the SUV had been moments ago, his pulse still racing, his hand still resting lightly on his holster, his mind spinning with everything that had just occurred. "He let him go," Carter finally muttered, his voice thick, as if the words themselves weighed 1,000 pounds. "What the hell, Carter? You can't be serious," the older officer demanded, his voice sharp. But Carter wasn't hearing it, wasn't really seeing them either. Everything was still too fresh, too jarring for him to process properly. "You don't understand," Carter said, his voice low and hollow. "They're not just criminals, these people, they're connected to something bigger, something I wasn't ready for." "What do you mean, connected to what?" the younger officer asked, his face wrinkled with confusion and concern. But Carter couldn't explain it. Not yet. It didn't matter anyway, because whatever he said now wouldn't make any sense without the full picture. But Carter knew one thing with absolute certainty: he had just crossed a line, and there was no turning back. "They were part of the syndicate," Carter muttered as the words left his mouth. They felt like a weight. He had to carry something heavy that would only grow harder to bear the more he learned. The officers exchanged glances, both of them knowing the rumors, knowing the whispers, but none of them truly understanding what that meant until now. "You let him go, Carter?" the older officer repeated, his voice tight with disbelief and frustration. "I didn't have a choice," Carter said, his voice flat as he turned to face his backup. "This isn't just a regular arrest. This isn't some gang. They've got their hands in everything: politics, law enforcement, everything you think you know about how things work. It's a lie." Both officers stared at him in stunned silence for a moment, but it wasn't just shock, it was fear that Carter could feel creeping up the back of his own neck as the implications of what he'd just done set in. "What are we supposed to do now?" the younger officer finally asked, his voice trembling with the realization that the world they had known, the world they had sworn to protect, might not be the world they thought it was. Carter didn't have an answer, not one that would make sense, not one that would make them feel safe, because he didn't feel safe either. "Get the file on the driver," Carter said finally, his voice stronger now as he focused on the task at hand. "There has to be something in there, something that ties him to this syndicate. We need to dig deeper, we need to understand what we're up against." The officers hesitated but nodded, their faces set in grim determination. They had no choice now but to follow Carter's lead. But Carter knew deep down that whatever they uncovered, whatever they learned, it wouldn't be enough to stop what was coming, because the syndicate wasn't just some criminal organization. They were something far darker and far more dangerous, something that moved in the shadows and controlled everything from behind closed doors, and Carter had just stepped into the heart of it. As the officers went to work gathering the pieces of the case, Carter's thoughts lingered on the driver, on his final words, "You're putting yourself in something you can't walk away from." Carter didn't know what that meant yet, but he could feel the weight of it pressing down on him as the first rays of dawn began to break across the horizon. He had walked into something far bigger than he could have ever imagined, and he knew that soon enough the consequences would catch up to him. Carter stood in the quiet of the early morning, the faintest glow of sunlight creeping up over the horizon, but it did nothing to chase the heaviness in his chest, the dread that settled deep inside him like a cold weight he couldn't shake. He had seen plenty of things in his years as an officer, but this felt different. This felt like a game where the rules had been rewritten and he hadn't been given the manual. The officers were already scouring through the papers in the SUV, where the driver had been seated. They were checking his personal effects, the car's registration, everything that could give them a hint about who the man really was and what kind of mess Carter had just stepped into. He could hear them muttering as they worked. No one really knew what they were looking for. It was all just a blur of half-formed ideas and guesses at this point. Carter's hand was still hovering near his holster, his body tense. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something that would throw everything they had just uncovered out of the window. He wasn't sure how much time had passed before the first piece of the puzzle fell into place, but when it did, it hit him like a slap to the face. The younger officer called over to him, "Hey Carter, you need to see this." Carter didn't hesitate. He walked over quickly, but carefully, not wanting to show any sign of vulnerability, no matter how much his heart was pounding in his chest. "What's up?" he asked as he approached the officer who was crouched beside the open car door. The officer held up a small manila folder, and Carter could see that it was bulging with papers, some kind of official-looking documents, but what caught his eye was the name written across the top. It wasn't the name of the driver, it wasn't even close. "What is this?" Carter asked, his voice tight. The officer flipped through the folder, his fingers trembling slightly as he skimmed the contents. Then he stopped suddenly and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Carter took it from him and scanned the contents quickly. His heart rate spiked as he read the name on the paper. But it wasn't just the name that shocked him, it was the title beneath it. Alexander Barrett, head of the syndicate. Carter's breath caught in his throat. The world seemed to tilt slightly as his mind raced to process what he was seeing. "This is the guy who was in the car?" the younger officer asked. Carter's gaze didn't leave the paper as his mind screamed that he had just made a mistake of monumental proportions. "This is the man behind it all," Carter said, his voice barely above a whisper, "the man who runs everything." "But how?" the officer asked, his voice rising slightly with disbelief. Carter could see the question written in his eyes, but there was no time for answers. Carter's head snapped up as a low hum filled the air. It was distant but growing louder by the second. The sound of an engine. He turned toward the street, his instincts kicking into overdrive. "They're coming," Carter said, his voice sharp with urgency. Before the officers could react, the unmistakable sound of an SUV's tires skidding to a stop echoed down the street, followed by the sound of doors opening and slamming shut. The silver-haired man and the man in black, they were back. Carter's mind raced with the implications of what was happening, but before he could make a move, a voice called out from behind them. "Carter!" He turned sharply to see a figure standing at the edge of the street, a familiar figure, one he hadn't expected to see today. Detective Thomas. Thomas was the lead investigator on the case involving the syndicate. Carter had heard of him for years, but had never worked with him directly. "What the hell is going on here?" Thomas demanded, his gaze flickering between Carter and the backup officers. "You're not going to like this," Carter said, his voice tense. "I need answers," Carter. Thomas pressed, But Carter's eyes were already on the approaching SUV, the silver-haired man's face, now clearly visible through the tinted windows as he took slow, deliberate steps toward them. It was too late for answers, now too late to make sense of everything that had been set in motion. Carter knew that the game had changed and that he was no longer in control. The silver-haired man stopped just short of them, his expression as cold and calculating as ever. "I told you, Officer Carter, you made a choice." Carter's heart raced as the situation unfolded around him, but there was nothing he could do, not now, not with the syndicate closing in around him. "You don't have to do this," Carter said, his voice filled with quiet desperation. But it was too late. The silver-haired man smiled thinly, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling certainty. "You should have walked away, officer. Now you'll learn why you can't escape." The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder behind Carter, and he knew in that instant that no matter what happened next, everything was about to change forever for him and for everyone who dared to challenge the power of the syndicate.